Welcome. My name is Jim Kelly. I teach in the law school here at Notre Dame. It's my pleasure to moderate this afternoon's presentation by Professor Alasdair MacIntyre of his talk entitled Heedlessness. Alasdair MacIntyre is a senior research fellow at the Center for Contemporary Aristotelian Studies in Ethics and Politics at London Metropolitan University, and a senior distinguished research fellow emeritus at Notre Dame's Center for Ethics and Culture. He has written widely in philosophy since his first book, Marxism and Interpretation, appeared in 1953. He has taught at Oxford, Princeton, Brandeis, Boston, Wellesley, Vanderbilt, Duke, and the University of Notre Dame. In 1989, he was a Luce visiting scholar at the Whitney Humanities Center of Yale University. He has also served as president of the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association. Professor MacIntyre is the author of over 30 books, including the influential triumvirate of recent works, After Virtue, A Study in Moral Theory, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, and Three Rivals of Moral Inquiry, Encyclopedia, Genealogy, and Tradition. He has made prominent contributions to the history of philosophy, moral philosophy, political theory, philosophy of the social sciences, and philosophy of religion. He recently published an examination of the philosophical work of Edith Stein, set against the background of 20th century phenomenology, entitled Edith Stein, A Philosophical Prologue, 1913 to 1922, as well as 2 volumes of his collected papers, The Tasks of Philosophy, Selected Essays, and Ethics and Politics, Selected Essays. His most recent book is God, Philosophy, Universities, A Selective History of the Catholic Philosophical Tradition. Although he retired from teaching in 2010, Professor MacIntyre remains domiciled at the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture, where he continues to write and to conduct his research. He served as the center's first permanent research fellow. We have about 75 minutes scheduled for today. Professor MacIntyre has let me know that his talk expects it to run about 45 to 50 minutes, which should give us a good amount of time for questions afterwards. There's microphones upstairs as well as right here. While we don't expect any problems with the microphone, please don't hesitate if you have any trouble during the talk hearing Professor MacIntyre to just wave and put your hand to your ear, and either he or I will make sure that the microphone is adjusted. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Alasdair MacIntyre.
Please take seriously what was just said about letting me know if I'm not audible. I'm hearing an echo here as I talk. Are you hearing an echo? Yeah.
We'll try that.
Is this better? Perhaps? No.
He's making adjustments.
Blame the engineers. There are salient aspects of our everyday lives that engage our attention recurrently and inescapably. Aspects of our shared lives in households, workplaces, schools, neighborhoods. There are other aspects, both of the local and the wider world, aspects of social, economic, political, and cultural happenings that secure more or less of our attention from time to time. Wars, drastic changes in the weather, crime statistics, bizarre occurrences reported in the media, fat man breeds thin ostriches. But there are also aspects of our everyday lives of which we may be in some marginal way aware, but to which we don't attend. And it's not just that we don't attend, we take care not to attend. We take care to exclude from consciousness facts that would cause us too much discomfort if we were to attend to them, facts that would put us to the question in ways that we don't want to be put to the question. So there are questions that it might seem obvious to ask, but which we rarely ask. Begin in the supermarket, any supermarket. A first generally unasked question is, whence this extraordinary quantity and quality of extraordinarily cheap food? For the food that American consumers buy in supermarkets is, compared with all other times and places, amazingly cheap. What makes it cheap is a complex matter, involving the economics of farming, transportation, and retail enterprise. But one important and indispensable cause of our food being as cheap as it is that the wages of farm workers, most of them Latin American and many of them immigrants, are as low as they are. According to the National Agricultural Workers Survey, published by the Department of Labour, farm workers on average work for 42 hours a week for $7.25 an hour. The average annual income for individuals is between $10,000 and $12,500, and for families between $15,000 and $17,500. 30% of farm workers have a family income that places them below the federal poverty line. So we can afford to buy and enjoy the cheap food from the supermarket as we do, only because so many farm workers work full-time for the best wages that they can get and yet live in poverty. We're as well-to-do as we are, only because they are as poor as they are. It's not just that ours is a society of the better off and the worse off, but it's a society in which those who are better off are so in key part because the poor are poor. I call the comfortable frame of mind which avoids attention to such facts heedlessness. Consider another example by returning to the supermarket and asking another generally unasked question: why is there a supermarket here? To which the immediate response may be, but surely there are supermarkets everywhere. This, however, is false. There are large areas in this country which have been described as food deserts. Consider one of them that is about to be no longer such, Greater Englewood on the south side of Chicago. In its 9 square miles, there have been up till now only 2 full-service grocery stores, while within 3 miles of where I wrote this paper, there are 7, a food jungle rather than a food desert. Soon in Greater Englewood, there will be a Whole Foods grocery, a grocery brought there not by market forces, as here, but by the persistent struggle of community organizations and the intervention of the city of Chicago. Why this contrast? Why do some have to choose between numerous stores, while others have either to do without or to engage in political struggle? In West Englewood, over 32% of the population have incomes below the poverty level. In East Englewood, the figure is almost 44%. Let us see if this makes things better or worse. There is an absence of what economists in Englewood, therefore, there's an absence of what economists call effective demand, a lack of incentives for the executives of supermarket chains to open supermarkets. Food deserts turn out to be areas whose population has to a large degree been abandoned by the agencies of economic growth, areas where investment is no longer profitable, areas whose population is no longer needed as a labour force. Happily for the larger economy, the investment opportunities necessary for its flourishing and the labour force that it needs are readily available in many other places, and so in consequence are supermarkets. But those who benefit rarely take note that it's generally only by happenstance that they belong to one of those populations that the economy needs for its labour force, rather than to one that has been discarded, that they inhabit a food jungle rather than a food desert. Here then is a second kind of injustice that is inflicted by the structure of the economy, an economy that not only imposes the hard life of the working poor on some, so that others better off may benefit, but that distributes its incentives and rewards so that they are made available to some but withheld from others. This structural injustice does not strike us every time that we visit the supermarket. We've learned to put it out of mind, and we lead more comfortable lives because we've learned this. Heedlessness is inattention to structural injustice. Consider now a third example. Begin with the rich, though not only with the highest incomes, but with the greatest wealth, and make the cut-off point wherever you like. The top 1%, the top 5%, the top 20%, the top 10%, even the top 25%, and ask what it is that they share as well as money. The answer is, of course, power. The power to make those investment choices which determine to what ends the resources of their society are directed. What is planted and what's reaped, what is manufactured and what not, who is employed and who's left without work. So who has the opportunity to become rich and to wield this power? The answer is complex again, but one part of it is obvious. If you're going to be able to become rich, not being so at the outset, what's generally indispensable is an education, the kind of education that from preschool onwards inculcates discipline and sophisticated skills, as well as the relevant knowledge. But the chances of any particular individual receiving such an education depend to a remarkable degree on how rich or poor their parents are, something that the rich themselves know very well, buying the best and generally the most expensive education that they can for their own children. The poor, however, all too often live where the worst schools are. There are areas in the United States which are educational deserts. In recent years, parts of Philadelphia, for example. The outcome in higher education is unsurprising. Of the children of those with the highest 25% of incomes, 73% enter college. For those whose parents' incomes are in the lowest 25%, the figure is 8%. And matters are getting worse. 30 years ago, on an 800-point scale, the average difference in SAT scores between a child of the richest 10% and a child of the poorest 10% was 90 points. Now it's 125. To be a child of the poor is therefore to have an unusually high chance both of never becoming adequately educated and of never becoming rich, and so never sharing in the financial and economic power that belongs to the rich. But financial power is also political power. Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page recently compared the influence on government policies in the United States of four sets of actors: average citizens, interest groups, where the interest is that of some large group of citizens, interest groups who represent some particular business interest, and the members of economic elites. Their data set allowed them to consider a very large number of policy issues. Their conclusion is that the two former, average citizens and mass-based interest groups, have little or no political influence, while business interests and economic elites have a substantial impact on policy making. Why and how this is so, I don't need to consider here. All my present argument needs follows from the conclusion arrived at by Gilens and Page, namely that those without an education that will enable them to achieve financial power are also generally excluded from political influence, let alone power. So here is a structural injustice that functions so as to prevent the remedying of structural injustice, as too does the general heedlessness of structural injustice. Whence then this heedlessness? Before we can address this question, we need to consider some of the ways in which we are apt to think about poverty in general. It's a commonplace, although a dangerously misleading commonplace, that the remedy for poverty is overall economic growth. What is true is that in economies such as those of present-day China and India, growth has raised and is still raising millions from the deepest poverty. But in the United States, this relationship between growth and a fall in the poverty rate came to an end some 40 years ago. Since the mid-1970s, growth in the United States has been over 140% per capita, while the poverty rate has moved up and down between 12 and 15%. The wages of the working poor during that entire period rose by just over 3%. So it's political superstition to believe that the implementation of policies designed to promote growth will by itself have any significant effect on poverty. Nor will such policies do anything to remedy the structural injustices that we've identified. In fact, growth has played a key part in generating structural injustice. It is higgledy-piggledy growth that produces demand for this rather than that results in resources being directed here and no longer there, that makes the interests of business interest groups and of economic elites what they are. The importance of growth is undeniable. Stagnating economies pose insoluble problems of various kinds. But the question that needs to be asked is that of how investment must be directed, of what kind of growth must take place if the evils of structural injustice are to be remedied. We will also make a mistake if we suppose that we can respond adequately to the problems of structural injustice by making those who suffer from it objects of philanthropy. Philanthropic giving is indeed indispensable in meeting urgent need of many kinds. Subtract from our world those organizations sustained by such giving, organizations as various as the Salvation Army, Catholic Relief Services, Doctors Without Borders, and Habitat for Humanity, and the world would be a much worse place than it is now. But no amount of philanthropic generosity will contribute to a solution to the problems posed by structural injustice. So it may well seem that there is no connection between the ways in which we now think about poverty more generally, that is, in terms of economic growth or philanthropy, and the ways in which we think, or rather fail to think, about structural injustice. But this too would be a mistake, for there is something significantly absent from our present-day thinking about poverty, which is closely related to our heedlessness of structural injustice. We can best identify it by contrasting how we are apt to think about poverty here now with how it was thought about and discussed in England during the first decades of the 20th century by Bernard Shaw and G.K. Chesterton. About how poverty was to be abolished, Shaw and Chesterton disagreed. Shaw was a Fabian socialist, while Chesterton believed that the coming to be of a socialist state would involve a concentration of political power that would be as potentially oppressive as the concentration of economic power in capitalist economies. About why poverty should be abolished, they also disagreed. For Shaw, it was a matter of the effects of poverty, a poverty which, and I quote, breeds filth, ugliness, dishonesty, disease, obscenity, drunkenness, and murder, and which, by degrading the poor, threatens the degradation of the rest of society. For Chesterton, it was primarily a matter of injustice. Very early, he set himself, in his own words, to defend the rights of man as including the rights of property, especially the property of the poor. What is unjust is the present system of property rights. Chesterton called it a shocking indecency, which has infringed and ignored the rights of poor people to have property. But Shaw and Chesterton agreed not only in their condemnation of any social order which results in extensive poverty, but in arguing that attitudes to poverty are a kind of moral touchstone, that how someone thinks and feels about poverty is a key to how good or bad they are. And generally, those attitudes are disquieting. So Chesterton wrote of his contemporaries that, and I quote, "Men feel that cruelty to the poor is a kind of cruelty to animals. They never feel that it is an injustice to equals, nay, it is a treachery to comrades." It was this insensibility that both Shaw and Chesterton aspired to correct. Shaw by his plays and prefaces, Chesterton by his journalism. And their debates over what they disagreed about turned this into a shared enterprise. What they agreed in identifying as missing in far too many was any sense of their common humanity with the poor, any sense that the deprivations of the poor were also an injury to them. About how that common humanity should be characterized, they were, of course, in conflict. But their shared claim that how we think and feel about poverty depends upon how we understand our common humanity is far more important. For this is a thought that characteristically we do not have, a thought that 100 years after Shaw and Chesterton is as unfamiliar as it was to those whom Chesterton castigated. So why is this so? What is it that's missing? The answer is that we lack anything like a shared adequate conception of common goods. We have no problem with the notion of collective goods, of public goods, of goods that each of us can achieve only through cooperation with others, whether it be through the construction of systems of roads and highways organized by the state, or through the pooling of individual savings in mutual funds. And we have no problem with the claim that certain conditions must be satisfied if a civil and orderly social life is to be sustained, and that we all of us have a shared interest in ensuring that those conditions are satisfied. Commonly, when politicians or Catholic bishops employ the idiom of the common good in their rhetoric, it is to such collective goods and to such conditions that they are referring. But of course, it's possible to uphold the common good so understood, and yet to tolerate, indeed to ignore, those structural injustices that I have identified. So, what stronger and richer conception of common goods is it that we need? What part does the concept of such a common good play in human life? What makes human beings distinctive among animal species is that their flourishing, whether as individuals or as groups, depends upon their directing themselves towards the achievement of certain goods, and that they can fail to direct themselves towards those goods, either because they misconceive them, or because of a certain willfulness, or both. The lives of human beings can go wrong in ways that the lives of members of other animal species can't go wrong. When the lives of chimpanzees, wolves, elephants, and dolphins go wrong, it's always because of external causes: injury, disease, famine, predators. Only human beings go astray in ways for which they themselves are responsible, by some failure of will or intellect, although, of course, they too are vulnerable to disease, injury, famine, and predators. It is then of the first importance that we identify correctly the goods to which we must be directed if we are to flourish. Many of them are achievable only in the company of others, and whether they are achievable or not depends upon our relationships to those others. Sometimes we engage in joint enterprises in which each of us benefits from cooperation with others, and has reason to cooperate only because and so long as that cooperation benefits us. Our joint enterprise is, for me, no more than a means to my particular ends, and for you, no more than a means to yours. For me, nothing is at stake but my good. For you, nothing is at stake but your good, and my and your actions are directed accordingly. But suppose that I so act in my role as a member of a household and family, treating household and family as no more than a means to my particular ends, and interpreting the actions of other household and family members as directed only to their particular ends. If I do so, I will have failed to recognize the common goods of household and family life, those goods without which household and family lack any specific point and purpose. Those common goods can be enjoyed only as a member of this or that particular household and family, as parent or child or aunt or grandparent, and they can't be enjoyed at the expense of other family and household members. Of course, family and household members make sacrifices for the sake of other members of household and family, most notably mothers for children, but also siblings for siblings, the adult child for the aged parent, and so on. But in making those sacrifices, they achieve their own good as mother, as sibling, as daughter or son. Of course, family life can be oppressive and exploitative. It is so when some family members are treated unjustly by others, when one spouse exploits the patience or affection of the other, when children, at times when they need their parents to listen to them, are not given a hearing, when children willfully disregard their parents' injunctions or parents impose undue burdens on their children. That is, when justice is absent. When justice doesn't inform a family's relationships, the members of that family will be unable to achieve that family's common good. Notice that justice not only requires parents on occasion to listen carefully to their children, those who don't know how to listen are in general unable to be just, but also to educate their children so that those children are able to articulate what needs to be said, and when it's appropriate, to feel free to say it. More generally, justice always requires communication. The relationship between justice and the common good holds in the case of other types of common good. Consider some of them. The common good of a school is to be achieved only by teachers, students, and others that work in the school, each receiving their just due. The common good of a school is achieved when its students each learn what each needs to learn, if they're to develop their powers and to be able to exercise those powers for good both now and later. Part of what they have to learn is how much they depend on others, on teachers and fellow students, and also on janitors and cleaners, and on those who prepare and serve their meals. They're in debt, a debt that they pay off by what they later contribute to the education of others. And as it is with families and households and with schools, so too with workplaces. The common good of a workplace is achieved when its workers contribute to the production of goods or services that sustain the life of their community in some significant way. It matters that what's done is done well, and that those who do well are recognized for what they do. It follows that, although relationships in the workplace are always and inescapably economic relationships, they're always also more and other than economic relationships. If workers are prevented from caring about the excellence of what they do because the way in which they are managed or a drive to maximize profitability precludes the achievement of excellence, then the common good of that workplace won't be achieved. And once again, justice is involved. For just relations in a workplace require not only that workers are recognized for their contributions to the common good of the workplace, but that they are listened to on what needs to be done if their workplace is to function well and they are to work well. This is one reason why strong trade unions are so badly needed. To have identified, even in this minimal way, the distinctive common goods of family and household, of school and workplace, makes it easy to understand why there must be another common good. Families and households, schools and workplaces are interdependent. Families and households can't function well unless there are schools and workplaces, schools to educate their children, workplaces where the adults can earn their wages, wages adequate to support the life of the family and household. Schools cannot function well unless there are families who have educable children and workplaces where their students can look forward to working. Workplaces can't function well without schools to educate their future workers, or without families that need the goods and services that they produce. So there's a good common to the entire local political society, which functions well only insofar as each individual plays her or his various parts well and has the qualities needed for so doing, that is, the virtues, and especially the virtue of justice. Justice is, of course, not the only virtue needed, because one can't be adequately just without having the other virtues in significant measure. If one lacks courage, then on occasion one will find oneself unable to be just. If one is intemperate in one's desires, then one will be unable on occasion to treat considerations concerning justice as overriding. And if one lacks prudence, one will be unable to judge what justice requires in particular situations. It follows that in order to achieve the common goods of local political societies, we need the virtues, and especially justice, and that any political society in which a concern for the just treatment of the other members of that society is seriously lacking will be one that has lost sight of common goods and of their importance in our lives. What is that importance? Mire your individual good as human being is indeed more and other than mire your individual good as family member, as teacher or student, as worker, and so on. But we can't hope to achieve our individual goods as human beings unless we're also directed to achieving those common goods which we share with others, as family members, teachers or students, workers, and so on. For to be a good human agent is to know how to integrate into a single life the goods of family, school, workplace, and the like, so that each has no more and no less than its due place and its due share of our care and attention. For the evidence that we take some good seriously is that we show ourselves to care about it, and we can't genuinely care about something without attending to it. So we are returned to heedlessness. What we are inattentive to, what we are heedless of, are matters where it seems to us that nothing very much is at stake concerning our good. The question for which I began was, why are so many of us so often heedless of manifest structural injustice? And we can now answer this question. In order to identify structural injustices accurately, we should have to appeal to a conception of justice that presupposes application for a strong concept of a common good. And in order to care about structural injustices, we should have to care about the relevant common goods as goods the achievement of which is indispensable to each of us. Suppose, however, that such a concept of a common good, and with it such a conception of justice, were absent from our generally shared thought and discourse, we would then have no reason to be struck by the facts of structural injustice. They would not appear as such in our political and moral landscape, and they would not invite any particular response. But to that of which we are unaware, we can't attend, and just this is too often our condition here, now. I noted earlier that ours is a social and political order that has an unproblematic concept of a public good, of a type of shared good from the achievement of which each of us will benefit as individuals, but which, if it's to be achieved, needs the cooperation of many individuals. But public goods so conceived are, as I've emphasized, very different from common goods, understood in the terms in which Aristotle and Aquinas understood them, the terms presupposed by my present argument. Public goods, even highly beneficial public goods, can be achieved unjustly, by, for example, paying unfairly low wages to those whose work brings them about and sustains them. Public goods can be enjoyed unjustly, as they are by free riders. Dictatorial political regimes can be highly effective in contriving public goods. Thus, a society in which people think in terms of public and private goods, but not of common goods, will be very different from one in which social relationships are structured by a shared conception of common goods. In the former, what is morally required of us is that we should be, whenever appropriate, other-regarding rather than self-regarding, setting aside self-interest for the sake of others. But in the latter, what is morally required of us is that we do not act so as to frustrate the achievement of common goods, goods that are at once mine, yours, and hers, so that my interests and those of others coincide. If I fail relevant others, I also fail myself. If I fail to be heedful of relevant others, I also fail to be heedful of myself. Consider the consequent differences in attitude to those who suffer from the structural injustices of our own society. For those who think in terms of morality as a set of other-regarding precepts, those others who suffer from the economic and educational deprivations that it inflicts are one among many set of others who deserve our concern, potential objects of our philanthropy, but no more than this. For those who think in terms of the kind of justice required for the achievement of common goods, structural injustice is an evil inflicted on them as well as on the poor. It matters that so many of the poor are not only poor, but unjustly poor. They, like Chesterton, have to see tolerance of the poverty that afflicts those suffering structural injustice as a betrayal of comrades. They, therefore, can't be heedless. What I'm suggesting, then, is that the dominant modes of political and social thought in our society here now dispose those who are educated into them to be heedless of structural injustice. So it's important to address these two maladies together, both the structural injustice itself and the general heedlessness in respect of it, by inviting our contemporaries to recognize themselves as, by their heedlessness, cooperating in the infliction of injustice. What makes them, what makes us heedless, is an image of ourselves as each of us succeeding or failing on our own, as individuals, rather than as succeeding or failing as contributors to those cooperative enterprises through which common goods are realized. Consider how these two self-images are related to career choices. In Finland, the majority of school teachers are drawn from the most able 25% of university graduates, and school teaching is counted among the most important contributions to the common life that anyone can make, and is therefore a highly prestigious occupation. Where do Harvard's and Yale's graduating classes, by contrast, go in large numbers? To jobs in financial services. And almost nobody thinks that their education has failed them. But now compare the educational achievement of children taught by Finnish teachers and children taught by American teachers, especially children from the lowest income families, and observe the effects of conceiving of success in one way rather than the other. So, what is to be done? 3 areas of our common lives deserve attention. I first ask what we still have to learn from the Leo XIII of Rerum Novarum and from Cardinal Manning. It was they who recognized that the problem of modern poverty is in key part a problem of justice. There is no justice, mercy, or compassion in the plutocracy, wrote Manning, and he elsewhere declared that we have been under the despotism of capital. The union of labourers is their only shelter. This declaration he translated into action with his support for the Great East London Dockworkers' Strike of 1889. Manning's belief, Leo XIII's belief, that working people can only secure economic justice for themselves and their dependents through trade union organization and action, is amply confirmed by the history of the American trade union movement. Begin where the argument of this paper began, with immigrant farm workers, and look to the history of the United Farm Workers of America. Farm workers today still suffer for many injustices, but their condition would be remarkably worse were it not for the achievements of the United Farm Workers of America, the achievements of great leaders such as Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, of a myriad of local organizers, and of rank-and-file union members. The history of trade unions in many other types of workplace provides further evidence that effective trade unions are the only defense that many working people have against structural injustice. And the weakening of trade unions is therefore always, directly or indirectly, a defense of injustice. Are trade unions, like every other type of human organization, liable to various kinds of corruption? Of course they are, but the remedy is always to reform them, if possible from within, not to weaken them. For trade union activity is one remedy for heedlessness. A second area in which effective action against structural injustice can be undertaken is that of education. Schools matter for 2 closely related reasons. The first, so obvious that it may seem almost unnecessary to state it, is that good schools enable children to transcend the limitations of their environment by developing intellectual, physical, moral, and aesthetic powers, so that not only do they become other than they were, but they're able to imagine themselves and their environment in very different ways. What would they and we become if they and we took Shakespeare or Dostoevsky or Scott Fitzgerald or Flannery O'Connor seriously? We wrong the children of the poor, not only if we fail to make it possible for them to learn the calculus or the truths of biochemistry, but if we fail to make them open to Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, Fitzgerald, and O'Connor. We should notice in passing that we wrong the children of the well-to-do if the effect of our teaching is to convince them that the point of their learning the calculus and biochemistry and of their reading Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, Fitzgerald, and O'Connor is to equip them for a successful career in the financial services sector. By this standard, both Harvard and Yale fail as universities, but not only they. A good education issues then, in among other things, a good school in a badly deprived area, an area suffering from structural injustice, not only enables individual students to overcome their deprivations by excelling academically, but educates some at least to be aware of and dedicated to overcoming structural injustice. It makes them incapable of future heedlessness. But schools are also important in quite another way. Begin with Catholic schools, especially Catholic high schools. They are widely and rightly recognized to have excelled and to excel in providing a worthwhile education. What's not been as widely recognized is the part that they have played in making and sustaining local community. And here the book that is essential reading is the path-breaking recent sociological study by Margaret Brinnig and Nicole Stella Garnett, Lost Classroom, Lost Community, Catholic Schools' Importance in Urban America. This is a book that needs to be read, and we should be very proud of the author's connection with Notre Dame. Let me focus on just a few points. Catholic schools not only function well as educational institutions, but by drawing teachers, and more especially parents and other family members, into a variety of school-sustaining activities, they become a focus for the life of the neighbourhood community. They foster long-term commitments, and with them social stability. They encourage hopes and aspirations, and with them a positive attitude towards the future. They are examples of what order and discipline can achieve and encourage, that is, a respect for norms and for goods. Note that the large majority of students and parents in many such schools are not Catholics. Insofar as the Church impacts on them, it does so indirectly. But of course, it does so. Parishes and parish priests, bishops and diocesan boards, and religious orders can and often do provide invaluable support systems for schools and teachers, and therefore indirectly for those networks of parent-teacher-child relationship that our community constituting. Here I put Brinnig and Garnett on one side for a moment to note that this may suggest that public schools can't hope to provide what Catholic schools have provided. But that's far from true. Some public schools have played a notable and honourable part in sustaining local communal life in deprived areas in Chicago and elsewhere. But it's far harder for them to perform this function than it is for Catholic schools. And of course, other schools with a religious foundation can also hope to make and sustain community, as Catholic schools have done. The history of Islamic schools in the United States is only just beginning. At the core of Brinnig and Garnett's book is the impressive evidence that they assemble of a close relationship between the closing down of Catholic schools and the decline of local communities into decay and disorder. It's therefore not just to the Catholic interest, but very much to the public interest that Catholic schools should survive and flourish. And one way to promote such survival and flourishing is by a system of vouchers that will assist parents not otherwise able to afford private school fees. The argument against such state funding of private education is that it's apt to further impoverish already needy public schools. And it is indeed very important that this should not be among its effects. What is required of the state is that it spend much, much more on public education, and that it spends what it spends much more equally, both for the sake of education and for the sake of community. What I have advocated so far as a starting point for confronting structural injustices is twofold: stronger and more effective trade unions and better and more effective schools. Let me add a third: a version of the negative income tax, as first conceived by Juliet Rees-Williams and then by Milton Friedman. The concept of the negative income tax is this: a basic level of income for individuals and households is determined, one sufficient to keep individuals and households from poverty. Everyone whose income is higher than this pays tax at appropriate rates. Everyone whose income is lower receives whatever sum will bring their income up to the basic level. Such a tax, in some respects, functions as the earned income credit functions now, but it covers those unable to work as well as the employed, and if the basic level of income were to be rightly determined, it would make minimum wage legislation unnecessary and remove the burden of paying the minimum wage from small businesses. Given that our spending habits and our budgeting habits are what they are, it would be important that what is paid out to the otherwise poor should be paid out in 12 monthly installments and not in one lump sum, as income tax refunds now are. The negative income tax has a number of merits. It enables government to substitute for a number of types of welfare payment a single payment, so that a single bureaucracy can do the work of several bureaucracies. But these considerations I put on one side. What matters for my present argument is only that it provides a means of raising the income of everyone significantly above the poverty line, and so partially remedying structural injustice. Someone at this point may remark that my three proposals are something of a political ragbag. For those who have advanced arguments in favour of more effective trade unions and for strongly redistributive taxation have commonly done so from the political left, while proposals for school vouchers and for the negative income tax have been elaborated by thinkers from the political right. But the underlying coherence I want to suggest is not in fact in my argument. It is in the conception of politics that makes things appear thus, a conception of politics that has been dominant in our culture for quite some time, and that we most of the time take for granted. Yet this conception of politics is itself one more source of the heedlessness with which I have been concerned throughout this paper. On this view of politics, there are on the one hand them, the needy and deprived, who constitute a continuing problem, and on the other hand us, the political agents who have as one task among others that of solving or at least alleviating this problem. But when politicians try to say what the problem is, they falter badly, and they do so because they're in the grip of an ideology, what I will call the liberalism versus conservatism ideology. The notion is that there is a spectrum of possible views running from a liberalism that sets no limit to government intervention in the economy to a conservatism that favours, so far as possible, an unregulated free market and a minimal government upholding law, order and security from external threats. Liberals define themselves by their opposition to conservatism, conservatives by their opposition to liberalism. Extremism and moderation are defined in terms of this spectrum. Each of the opposing views comes to politics with its own set of solutions to social problems, but each defines the problems in terms of its own particular proposed solutions, so rendering the actual problems invisible. What then is wrong with this dominant but absurd ideology? First, it frames political alternatives in terms of the state on the one hand and the market on the other, as though these could still be contrasted as they were in the 19th century. But what we confront today is a new Leviathan, the state and the market, a monstrous amalgam of the public and the private, of interlocking and interacting corporations and government agencies, of heterogeneous relationships. The largest unsolved problem, or rather set of problems, is that of how to make the various parts of the Leviathan, which in the United States includes the Congress, accountable. Secondly, the dominant ideology lacks any adequate conception of common goods, as they've been characterized in this paper, and therefore of the kind of justice that is required if such goods are to be achieved. It's because it lacks an adequate understanding of justice that this ideology so largely ignores the facts of structural injustice, and it's because it ignores those facts that it contributes to the general heedlessness. Present-day American political debate is the opium of the American people. A third failure of the dominant ideology is that it begins with large-scale general propositions about the nature of government or the functioning of markets. But we need to begin instead from the local and the particular, from local and particular common goods and local and particular failures and injustices. Do not, for example, begin by asking what kind of national curriculum, if any, there should be. Begin by asking what would be a good school for my children and my neighbours' children here now, one that would educate them so that they wouldn't suffer from the defects and deprivations for which so many suffer. Then ask what else would have to be the case for such a school to flourish. What else by way of providing work and wages for parents here now so that their children might enjoy a good home life? What else by way of teacher education so that those children might have good teachers? What else by way of the provision of law and order so that those children might live in a secure neighbourhood? And don't ask these as theoretical but as practical questions that issue in action. Action not only at local but also at regional and national levels. Note that a society in which these questions had been adequately answered would have no problem of structural injustice. A merely local politics is, of course, insufficient, but a politics that doesn't begin from and is not rooted in local and particular concerns, local and particular injustices, will be an inadequate politics. To say what an adequate politics would be would, of course, take me far, far beyond the scope of this paper. Yet one measure of adequacy is this, that while on the way to rescuing us from structural injustice, such a politics would also rescue us here and now from heedlessness of structural injustice.
Professor MacIntyre, we do have about 25 minutes in the remainder of the session, so please make your way to the microphones and I'll recognize you in turn. And we can start right here. Please introduce yourself and then pose your question.
Hi, Professor MacIntyre. Victor Science, Rice University. Thank you for your talk. So I had two questions. One is mostly clarificatory. So you mentioned that with a notion of common goods as opposed to public goods, there's a very deep sense in which, in the case of structural injustices, I can really say, even if I don't immediately suffer from them, I can say, this is an evil inflicted on me. My question is, first question, can you just clarify a little bit of how that relationship works? I can see how it doesn't play in with the conception of public goods, but if you might say a little bit more about how it does play in.
Okay. Begin with the household and the family. And begin with the way in which, in caring for the good of other members of the family, and therefore caring also for the good of the family, for caring about them as family members, I'm also caring for my good. Yeah. Because if my family doesn't flourish, I don't flourish. And therefore, here there is a case where if I think of myself as having a good distinct from the household and the family, then I'm going to think of myself as either on the one hand making use of the family as a means, or if I'm a highly moral person, I'll think of myself as nobly sacrificing myself for the sake of the family, and I will go around and say, gosh, what a good person I am. Now, we need to then think, if I were to develop this at length, something you really wouldn't want me to do, I would have to talk about the workplace, the school, and various other institutions, because we only understand political society insofar as we understand it as integrating those institutions. This is why it's quite wrong, if you're thinking about justice or injustice, to begin with political society, independently of talking about the other institutions. So now I have to care about, very obviously, let's take one intermediate stage, it matters to me a good deal how good the schools are in my community and neighborhood, because this is going to make a great deal of difference to what kind of people I'm dealing with, not only the children themselves, but the teachers, my fellow citizens. And then on a larger scale, this means that I'm going to be in a political society in which I'm going to be dealing with people who suffer from structural injustice, by the way, and this is very important, don't generally behave very well. The poor are not noble. If I had talked at greater length about Shaw, one of the reasons why Shaw was a socialist and wanted to get rid of poverty was he thought the poor were nasty. That's a silly generalization, but it is quite clearly the case that you will not have a good society if a sufficiently large number of your fellow citizens are not in fact participating fully. And this partly for the obvious reason that they will in fact be available as a populist vote of various kinds, but also that all kinds of social and economic relationships will be deformed as a result. That needs developing in detail, and that I can't do here. But does that begin to make the outline of the argument?
Yes. No,
Good.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I guess the second concern is, so you mentioned the three areas that you propose as areas where we can do something about these structural injustices, so trade unions and education. So I guess I wonder, given in light of some of what we heard, especially last night, I wonder where do you see the role of supporting families in inculcating virtues to their children?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last.
Where do you see the role of helping families to inculcate the role of children? Even I could see where education plays into that, but I could see other things that are not necessarily fit into the bracket of education. So I guess I wonder if you might speak to how you think supporting families might be helpful in this proposal.
Let me just say one thing, and I hope that it speaks to your question. You don't, in fact, inculcate the virtues by talking about inculcating the virtues. So that people who say to themselves as parents, we must be very careful to bring up our children so that they have the virtues. It's not clear that good things are going to happen in such a family. We develop the virtues insofar as we act together with others to achieve certain goods and learn that we can't achieve those goods without having certain qualities of character. By learning, for example, that our failures in various kinds are due to failures of various kinds of character. So a good family, a good workplace is very often one where people have learnt from their own mistakes. It's not a family with a history of unbroken goodness. In fact, I've never come across such a family. Or a family with the notion that there are bad families and problems, then good families that don't. Families work their way well through problem situations or badly and develop character insofar as they do this. So this is how the family educates. Now, what the school does is it takes children out of the narrowness of family life, because family life has to be narrow. It can't. If the contrast between the family and the great world weren't real, the family wouldn't function like it does. And the schools move towards translating this education into education for the greater world. Okay?
We'll take one more down here before moving up there, before coming back.
Thank you. To pursue a common good seems to require knowledge of some shared end. So can we pursue other common goods with any kind of certainty without knowledge of our shared end? That is, if we can't agree man was created to assimilate himself to God, will we ever have social justice? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't hear the last bit. I couldn't understand.
Okay, so if we can't agree that man was created to assimilate himself to God, will we ever have social justice, or how much social justice can we actually have?
Okay. My answer to this question relates to what I said in the last question. Just as it's not the case that a good family will be one in which the parents deliberately and, as it were, in the head, theoretically, set themselves to become good. I mean, this is fine. People do this. Their young parents are very nervous. They read books. They get advice. They want to do well. But in the end, it's not out of resolutions. Well, in a parallel way, in wider communities, it's not necessarily the articulate beliefs that people have that determines whether they flourish well as a community in relation to their ends. It very often is how they behave when confronted with great difficulties, sometimes failures on their own part, failures on the other part. And we do have striking examples of communities at various stages in history where people have come together, surmounted difficulties, constituted themselves as a community without having ostensibly shared religious beliefs or with those beliefs not functioning, particularly in the flourishing of the community. And so I do think that people who, at least on the surface, don't acknowledge God are in fact often capable of actually achieving common goods of a variety of kinds. And I think that this is a very important truth about the natural order, that human beings, although their achievements are always fragile and vulnerable, and they make many great mistakes and errors and go astray, real achievement of common goods in the natural order is possible.
We're going to go up here now.
Hi, Dan Sportello.
Just try to speak loudly if you can, Dan. Thank you.
Hello? Am I getting anything here?
No, I think you just have to speak loud. I'm sorry.
My name is Dan Sportello. This is somehow still on at Notre Dame. Thought all of that. Okay. So my question is this. You speak of self-conceptions whereby each of us take ourselves to be members of various communities and thereby working towards certain common goods. It seems that one of the things that's happened over the past 100, 150, 200 years is that, in general, conceptions of ourselves as members of communities working towards common goods have been, for better or worse, rightly or wrongly, discredited. They've come to be seen mostly as exploitative fictions. I think of, for example, sacrificing oneself on behalf of, say, the nation or something like this. Was this a mistake? And if it wasn't a mistake, how can we have an alternative way of generating self-conceptions?
Well, there are two things here to be said, very different things. Let me start with the first. I didn't use the word self-conception.
Sure.
And it's very much not my word. What makes me somebody's son, grandchild, cousin, brother, isn't up to me. I find myself in this social situation. And then there are various ways in which I can respond. And I can respond either with an eye to the common good of the family to which I belong, or indeed we could spell it out in terms of the workplace or the school or the clinic or any other institution that has a common good. And I come to understand myself in part through understanding how other people understand the part that I have to play. So it's all right to talk of myself as understanding myself in a particular way, but it's very important to recognize that how I understand myself is inescapably bound up with how other people understand me. That's the first thing I'd want to say. The second thing I'd want to say is the notion that these notions of belonging to families, workplaces, clinics, nations, whatever, the notion that this is something that has been discredited or even thought to be discredited in the last 200 years just seems to be false. Perhaps there are people who do believe this, but I don't even see how you could believe it. Let me go to I am old enough. One of the few advantages of being old is that you can remember the past, and characteristically you can remember the past so far back that there isn't anybody around old enough to contradict you. So I remember very clearly, if I may take an episode that I take to be very important for the United States, the Vietnam War. for all sorts of curious reasons. But one is I happen to know extremely well both people who thought it was their duty to go to the war and to take part in it, no matter how misguided they might think the government policies that had led to that war. It was their duty to their community and then their duty to their fellow soldiers to play a part in this, because the common good of society depended on people taking this very seriously. I also knew extremely well people who were prepared to put their whole career on the line in opposing the war and in trying to bring it to an end, because they believed the war was in various ways corrupting the social order and was against the common good. And what you had here were two rival and incompatible views of the common good of American society. And one of the tragedies of American society was that this argument was abandoned and not resolved. That it was an argument that was carried up to a certain point and then people walked away from it. And one of the most moving aspects of the Vietnam War Memorial, and it's a memorial that I think should be very important to a great many of us, is the memorial says nothing. The memorial honors the dead by being silent. And that being silent is, I think, a mark of what happened, that for the sake of which people died and that for the sake of which other people gave up their career prospects, that argument didn't get carried through. Now, this was because it was too painful. Again, if we talk about this, we'll talk about it. But we couldn't tell this history without talking about people with strong senses of the common good. I chose the Vietnam War, but I could equally have talked about all the wars in which the United States has been involved since, and also about a great many other political episodes. So I just think it's not true. I think people are, in fact, involved. But what has happened is that at a certain level of thinking, we have ceased. I mean, at a certain point, although people were moved, and still are, up to a point, moved by these memberships, everybody understands what I'm saying, we do not any longer have sufficiently shared conceptions of common goods. We aren't sufficiently longer moved by these, so you get the kind of heedlessness that I'm talking about. And this then comes to the surface in our attitudes to the poor and to heedlessness, just as Chesterton thought.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you very much for your lecture. Sorry for my English. I come from Spain, IESC Business School, Universidad de Navarra. And I wanted to focus on the idea of the common good of the workplace. You recognize that there is a common good of the workplace. I understand that that would mean that there is a common good shared by capital owners, workers, and management. At the same time, there's always a tension. That tension demands workers to have a voice and trade unions for the purpose to enter in that communication. But I wonder if you really think that there is a common good in our modern firm, in our modern corporate laws, and if the most radical solution to the tensions in a workplace are trade unions, or should be more at the level of how within the firm, in the governance of the firm, are structured shareholders, management, and workers, somehow, like in the German model. Or so, in other words, is the modern firm or the USA modern firm a community that may have a common good? And if it's not, wouldn't it be focusing on trade unions a subtle way of heedlessness, because we are not able to recognize the deep root of the problem? Thank you.
Good. This one would keep us here for 3 weeks, not for 3 hours. But let me say just 2 things. How many people here have heard of the Cummins Engine Company? Good. Well, it's very...
Because you told me about it.
Yeah, okay. Columbus, Indiana, 1918. An auto mechanic reads about diesel engines. Diesel engines are only beginning to make an impact in Europe it occurs to this mechanic that the diesel engine might transform trucking, that you might be able to have trucks that were able to travel far longer distances, be much more economically effective. And so he's interested in doing what we would call research on this. Though he doesn't call it research. But he goes to his bank manager, the man with whom he's had all his dealings as an auto mechanic, and the bank manager is intrigued. The bank manager is an interesting guy. He happens to be called Cummins. And he says, okay, we'll finance you. And to cut what was in fact a long story admirably short, make it shorter, something like 10 or 12 years later, in fact a little bit more than that, they're able to found a company which manufactures diesel engines for trucks, which doesn't just try to sell them, but also gets data all the time on how they're used and on how to improve them. So the fundamental aim is to make an excellent diesel engine. The chief executive officer of the company, the person who runs it, it turns out, is the bank manager's nephew, who has been to Harvard and has been to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and comes back to Columbus, Indiana, to run this company. They don't make a profit until, I think, 1934, 33, 34, sometimes like that. That is, it takes from 1918 to 1934 to get any return at all on the money. And then they become very successful. And very successful not only as a business enterprise, but as what I've called a research enterprise. Because the great aim is to do something really well, to make excellent diesel engines that will in fact transform trucking, that will in fact therefore do something very positive for the American economy. And workers get well paid by the standards. It's a thing in which workers are seen as contributors to the common enterprise. Now, one of the things you notice about this immediately is that the people who invested in Cummins at the beginning did so for the long haul, that they had a time scale in which they were prepared to see certain goods achieved. Characteristically, that don't happen anymore. It don't happen anymore partly because at the level of investment, hedge fund managers are evaluated on how they do quarterly. If you said to a hedge fund manager, how would you like to work on an 18-year schedule? Right? And it matters that this diminution of time means that enterprises behave quite differently. Now, everything is quite different in relation between management and workers depending on time scale. If you're engaged in a long-term time scale, you need a stable and lasting labor force. One that was only prepared to, in fact, last the day if it's treated justly in terms of its reward as things develop. Mostly, of course, trade unions are never put, nobody ever says to them, how do you like to take part in a long-term enterprise? They argue, we have to keep our costs down this month. And so long as you think in those terms, the more you diminish the time scale, the more you get conflict. Now, this is only one factor. I mean, if we were to tell the whole story about time scales, it'd be a long story. And then we bring in all the other factors. But whether or not the degree to which the interests of trade unions and the interests of employers do or do not lead to conflict is a part of a number of considerations that are normally just not brought into play at all. Let me give you another example. This is sufficiently important. I talked a lot about the importance of schools and I talked about trade unions. And I rather expected that somebody would get up and say, well, where do you stand on teachers' unions? Because teachers' unions are often thought to stand in the way of development of good schools. And there's a very good reason why teachers' unions behave like this. Once people go into the classroom in the United States, by and large, they're on their own. We recruit people to teaching who themselves very often need more education than they actually got, and we then don't give them the support in the classroom that they need if they are to be developed as effective teachers over a longer time. And so when the issue of the evaluation of teachers is raised by employers, trade unions, teachers' unions, feel teachers are being victimized. They're going to be evaluated when they've never been given the resources for developing the strengths that would enable them to do well in their evaluations. So, when confronted with this situation, with the arguments that go on about between teachers' unions and education authorities about the evaluation of teachers, you have to again stand back and say, what do we do to support and mentor and continue educating teachers after they have entered the classroom, and indeed right through their teaching career in many cases? One of the great things about ACE, about Father Scully's enterprise, the Association for Catholic Education, is that it does understand the need for supporting teachers and giving them more and more resources and support as they go on, and not just getting them into the classroom and then walking away. So at this point, again, trade unions and employers are at odds because the issue is wrongly framed. And Cummins Engine Company is a huge example in the past of people who framed the issues rightly and therefore didn't have problems of conflict that other people have. Sorry to have talked for so long.
That's perfect. Actually, that's perfect. We've just gone a little bit beyond our time. I want to thank you for your attention, and please join me in thanking Professor MacIntyre for his talk.